Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are here today to give a presentation on FEMA's Historic Preservation Act responsibilities and programs throughout our disaster life cycle. I'd like to get started with introducing myself and some other members of our training today. My name is Mary Shanks. I'm currently the Deputy Regional Environmental Officer for FEMA Region 1 here in New England. I help oversee our historic preservation program, and also with me presenting this training is Catherine Emmett and Kathleen Philp. They are both historic preservation specialists with our team and work primarily with our PA program, our public assistance program, which we'll talk about a little bit more, and our national disaster program, which we will also get into just a little bit. Just to give a little background about why we are presenting this training. This training was developed as part of a treatment measure to mitigate the effects of one of our projects at Sleeping Giant State Park. Sleeping Giant State Park was damaged during a microburst in 2018. As part of our recovery actions for that park, there was significant amounts of ground disturbance that included removing some of the stone from the mountain. Because the area is a location of religious and cultural importance to federally recognized and state recognized tribes in the state of Connecticut, we needed to work with the tribes as well as the state to mitigate those effects. And one of the approaches that we took was delivering this training so that future applicants for FEMA grants could be better informed about the process and know the steps to take. All right, so before we get started today, I just want to go briefly over our objectives for this training. The primary focus is to give an introduction on FEMA's Historic Preservation Act review responsibilities. But before we get into those, we're going to get started with explaining what FEMA's Environmental and Historic Preservation Program is all about, what kind of staff we have, and the kind of things we review. Then we're going to go quickly through the disaster cycle and the Stafford Act and FEMA's role in responding to and preparing for disasters. And then we will move to our main topic, which is the National Historic Preservation Act and FEMA's responsibilities for consulting with state historic preservation officers and federally recognized tribes and other parties of interest, including state recognized tribes who we work with before, during, and after disasters. So, what is or who is FEMA EHP? FEMA EHP is one national cadre of responders. We are broken up into 10 regions as well as one national cadre of staff. We review multiple programs and have multiple specialties under our programs, but we have one unified mission, which is to help our states, local and tribal partners prepare for and respond to disasters before, after, and during events. What do? We provide sound guidance on how to comply with environmental and historic preservation regulations, laws, and executive orders. We provide technical assistance for how to address those aspects and historic and hazard mitigation plans, historic plans for communities, as well as during project formulation and all the way through project closeout at the end. What kinds of staff do we have? What kind of programs and backgrounds do our EHP staff have? So EHP staff come from a variety of diverse backgrounds. And they have the skills and the knowledge to complete a variety of reviews. We have archaeologists, geologists, biologists, structures specialists, floodplains specialists, water quality folks. We basically have a whole lot of people with the last initials of IS in their titles. We come from a variety of backgrounds. Like I said, some of us, I'm an archaeologist. My main training is in anthropology and archaeology. I went to school especially to study historic archaeology, or the archaeology of the early modern period, from about the time written records started in most areas, give or take a few centuries on either side, all the way up through modern day. We have other staff like Catherine and Kathleen who focus on historic buildings and historic structures, and they're specialized in everything kind of above ground, while I take the stuff that is below the ground. On the other half of our office, on the environmental side, we have folks, like I said, that are water quality specialists or who work with geology. Those are the guys who are working on hydraulic analysis, just how much force is coming down the mountains as we have flooding events, or people who specialize in biologists who know way more about fish and birds than I could ever dream, and help take care of some of our Endangered Species Acts reviews. Basically, we try to have all the staff we need to provide the best guidance to you guys at the state, local, and tribal level. So how does somebody get into this field? Well, everybody has their own unique story, and I'm sure, and we all kind of love to share them because it's always a unique journey to get here. I grew up really loving history. I had a father who really loved history. We always used to go and tour the local historic sites, but then I got to college and I was trying to focus on my background, and I was considering sociology or other things that would help people and help understand people, but I decided that I wanted to combine the two, so I ended up going into archaeology, which both allows me to study people and understand how they live and work, but to also focus on the historic aspects of our society. We've got other folks who really grew up really loving endangered species and trying to figure out how can they help them, or just concerned about the environment. And these days, more and more of our staff are coming on because they have an interest in helping communities address climate change and other challenging impacts in their communities. So what do we do? FEMA EHP, right, as I said, reviews all FEMA grants across our various programs to ensure that they are complying with federal environmental laws, regulations, and executive orders. We also provide technical assistance on the formulation of projects, looking at hazard mitigation plans, making best advice on how to approach challenges in ways that avoid EHP compliance issues, and we ensure that our processes and review requirements are best integrated into all our programs by working hand in glove with everybody over on the program side to ensure that you get that we meet the FEMA mission in a way that is smooth and hopefully transparent to anybody who comes in and applies for a FEMA grant. What kind of projects does EHP review? So we see a little bit of everything. Like I said, any grant that comes into FEMA does come through the EHP shop. So that means we review a little bit of everything. Our bread and butter these days seems to be culverts, roads, and bridges. Pretty much every culvert in New England is a tad bit undersized when we see quite a few upgrades from about 24 to 36 inches to 4 or 5 feet or much larger than that. We are also working on projects that are improving and repairing our flood walls, levees, and seawalls throughout our coastal communities. We are doing elevations both of roads and bridges to bring properties up out of the floodplain so that people can evacuate if needed along the roads, or and so that their homes are not flooded during events in terms if they stay in them, to even if they are not physically there, hopefully while the flood is occurring, that their building is still there and undamaged when they return. We do flood control and stream bank restoration projects, flood proofing of commercial buildings, debris removal obviously after a storm, as well as emergency protective measures or homeland security measures that help harden and protect our facilities around the region from potential human actions or human caused disasters as well. So what are the EHP considerations? Like I said, today we are here focused on our cultural resources, historic properties, including historic buildings, as well as archaeological sites and resources. But EHP also reviews a wide variety of other resources that could be potentially impacted by FEMA's mission. That includes floodplains. That's one of the big concerns for us. That's a life, health, and human safety issue. It is very dangerous, and we want to ensure that when we are working in the floodplains, we are taking all available steps to ensure that human life is protected, whether that's by removing properties from the floodplain, elevating them out of the way, or at least ensuring that they are dry flood proof to the best of our availability. And looking at that, it's mostly concerned with both the special flood hazard area as well as looking at whether or not things are in the floodway areas of real heightened concern where real dangerous flooding occurs. We'll look at wetlands, which are protected and preserved for a variety of environmental reasons, but they also provide flood storage. So those are important resources that we take a look at. Endangered species, including the habitats where they live. We have quite a few species here in Region 1, including our best friend, which is the northern long-eared bat. We have piping plovers and roseate terns along the coastlines, several species of trees and plants as well that we consider, and a few other critters, including a bumblebee species, as well as another bat, the little brown bat, and the Indiana bat in more northern regions of the area. We review for projects that are in coastal areas. That's because they deal with high impacts from tides and wave action along the coast. We look at water quality to ensure that the water we are drinking is clean and prepared. Air and noise, vegetation and wildlife. All of these kind of come together. Some of our real priorities in the last few years have been focused on environmental justice, ensuring that the projects that we are doing in communities that already have challenges, for whether it's because of historical reasons or modern actions, that we are taking a close look at those and ensuring that we are causing no further harm, and ideally to kind of reduce some of the burdens that those communities are already dealing with. So to do that, we look at socioeconomic resources, current land use. We try to preserve good agricultural land where we can, because that cannot really be restored once it's been transferred over away from agriculture. We also look at hazardous materials as well. One of the big changes in the last few years, and it's not currently on the list, is a real focus on looking at issues associated with climate change, both ensuring that our properties are prepared, or our projects are prepared for climate change, to ensure that we're elevating buildings to the right level or building levees that can withstand future flood events, but also ensuring that none of the projects we're working on would contribute to climate change. So those are all considerations that we have. So how do we do our EHP reviews? Well, we work with a variety of partners, both at the federal level, other federal agencies, the Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Wildlife Service, as well as NOAA, and other federal entities that also give out grants. That would be HUD or the EPA. We work with them on a variety of projects. But in addition to that, we also consult with our state historic preservation officers. Every state has a state designated historic preservation officer, and we work very closely with them both to identify resources as well as to determine to work with them to help determine our impacts to those resources and to look at ways to mitigate it. Obviously, our tribal governments are really important consulting parties that we work with every day. They have we have 10 resident tribes in Region 1 at the moment, plus 3 tribes that we work with who are no longer resident in Region 1. And we make sure that we consult with them on any project that may impact their historical lands or areas of interest where they still have religious or cultural concerns, and our projects may impact those resources. And we also work with other interested parties. That can be local historical societies, environmental groups that have particular concern in places, just land use people, land use organizations. If there is a biking organization that might use a resource, we might consult with them as well, just to make sure that we are properly seeing everyone's viewpoint and allowing them to contribute to the conversation about how we need to address these resources. So what are the benefits of EHP review? Okay, the first one on this list is a really big one. It's about informed decision making. The vast majority of EHP laws are process laws, which means they are just steps that we need to go through to help inform the decision making and don't specify any specific outcome or intent, right? The purpose of these process laws is to ensure that the decision makers that are choosing the path forward, whatever that may be, have all the information in front of them so that they can make the best decision possible. It really is focused on maximizing the positive benefits while reducing the negative impacts. The idea is not that EHP says no to projects. We don't do that. As long as we're there ahead of time and we're working with you, it is a process that we will step through and try to get you the best outcome available for your projects. Ensuring compliance is good, but the real intent is to make sure that we are maximizing the use of federal resources so that we aren't building something that is just going to be impacted by the next storm that's coming up the way. Okay? So the intent, like I said, is to protect community investments, making sure we're spending money wisely, make sure we are not putting lives at risk by taking actions that place them at further danger by encouraging development within the floodplains, and also protecting those aspects of our community that really make them what they are, right? New England is a very historic region. A lot of our economy is based off of tourism, that come into our community, whether that's our coastal areas during the summer and people being able to enjoy our beaches and our communities along the beach, or whether it's our leaf peeping visitors in the fall coming to check out those areas, or our maple farms or Christmas tree farms. These are real vital parts of our economy, and the EHP review process is intended to protect those resources and ultimately to protect our economy and way of life here in Region 1. So what happens when we don't comply with EHP review requirements? So this is the bad part. We never want to talk about any of these. We hope they never ever come up, but occasionally they do. When either something moves ahead of the EHP review, or we fail to follow through on an aspect of a condition that may have been priced on a project. These do sometimes happen, right? We don't like them. We try to avoid them whenever possible, but just so that you're aware of the potential consequences of not complying. It could be everything from a denial of funding, because we can't bring a project back into compliance, we can't fix the situation, so it could endanger the funding for a project. It could result in project delays. We've had situations where we've had to say, oh no, wait, you need to stop. You can't complete construction on this action. We need to complete the EHP review before you go any farther. That, of course, comes with costs associated with work stops and everything else, which everyone would like to avoid. It's also negative publicity. Nobody likes to see bad press or bad reviews of projects that we're doing to try to help our communities. There can also be civil penalties and fines from under some of our regulations. A couple of our laws do have potential fees and fines that are associated with them. So the more that we can get ahead of those potential impacts, again, we can reduce the costs and ensure things remain compliant. And then the last one is lawsuits. That does happen. It is very rare, but it can happen, and we want to work with you to make sure that we are avoiding that whenever possible. All right. So hopefully you guys have seen this wheel before. This is the disaster life cycle wheel. I like this one because it does kind of include that central structure that talks about who we're working with and who is responsible at every different phase of the disaster. It is a wheel, which means you can kind of start at any point of it and get the full life cycle of disasters. But we're going to go ahead and start with a disaster event up there in the upper right quadrant of our chart. So when an event happens, this is our first response phase. We're going to go into a little bit more detail of all of these later on, but the response phase is the immediate aftermath of the disaster. This is when we are doing our best to ensure that all of our lifelines, our power, our roadways, our hospitals are all safe, secure, and active, and getting them back into functional status as soon as possible. After we make sure we take care of those, we can look more at the long-term recovery aspects. That's moving down into the lower right quadrant of the wheel. This is where the bulk of EHP reviews are done in our recovery phase. This is everything from replacing culverts, replacing bridges, rebuilding schools and power line systems, basically anything and everything that could have been impacted by the disaster. As we continue to move around the wheel and we move farther into recovery, we're going to start to look at mitigation. What can we do to prevent these things from happening again? Right? How can we ensure that these resources are better protected and better recovered so that the next storm that comes through, we don't have these same flooding issues? We've seen a lot of success with this in our region over the last few years. We have projects that we have done in states where they had flooded significantly in the past, but we've managed to do mitigation actions, floodplain restoration projects, and when a new flood comes in, they weren't damaged this time. So this is a really critical phase for us, and a moment where we spend a lot of time really working and thinking through what's the best possible way to avoid future impacts. And then finally, we move back into the preparation and training phase, right? We have recovered. Our communities are back to what we call their blue sky lives. But there's still things to do. There are still things to consider. How can we better prepare so our staff can respond faster and more appropriately in the future? What can we do in terms of planning for future mitigation actions? our future work to avoid other properties becoming impacted in the future? Can we do things that help improve the safety of our communities? Are there homeland security approaches that we can take to ensure that our communities are safe from any of the potential challenges that are out there today? So the wheel is designed in these 4 quadrants, but in truth they all kind of overlap and they're all kind of occurring simultaneously. The focus is we need to be doing all 4 of these things: responding, recovering, mitigating, and preparing, because what may be an effect from one storm, and when we might have a flooding disaster, there may be still things going over on the mitigation or planning phases for issues like wildfires or tornadoes or other kind of events that can challenge our community. So while it's a wheel and we kind of go through all 4 steps, they can all happen simultaneously. So the next thing I just want to briefly touch base on is the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief Act. This is the law that authorized the creation of FEMA, and it's still what we operate under today. It was signed into law in 1988. And it basically authorizes the president to declare disasters and authorizes FEMA to respond to those disasters by providing relief to our communities. In order for FEMA to get involved in a project or in a disaster after a storm or after an event, a federal major disaster declaration has to be declared. There's a process for that I'll get into on the next slide. But once a disaster is declared, FEMA will start mobilizing its staff and getting on the ground. But the best thing to remember here is that all disasters and disaster response activities are locally led initiatives. So it starts with the state and local communities or tribal communities, and then once those resources are overtaxed or strained, then FEMA comes in with the major disaster declaration, and then we respond from there. So how does a disaster get declared? So this chart kind of just steps through the disaster declaration process. It starts, like I said, at the local level, whether that's the tribal level or the local community or state community. They are going to prepare for an event. They will be responding to the event. They will be reaching out to FEMA to let them know if they need additional assistance or additional resources in order to respond to that, and we will assist to the best of our ability. But once they are truly overwhelmed, then they will submit a request for government assistance. Frequently, if this is happening in the immediate response of a disaster, the state will first do disaster assessments on the state and local level, and they'll call in FEMA. We will come in and do preliminary damage assessments to see if the threshold for each community is met. Every community has a slightly different threshold depending on the economic realities of that state or community. But once that threshold is met, the governor makes an official request to the President of the United States. The President works with FEMA to ensure and review the PDA findings, and then once he has approved those, FEMA will make a recommendation to the President, and the President will either approve that declaration event or not. But once it is declared, that's when we really roll out, and you'll start to see the establishment of our field offices and really boots on the ground for FEMA's response. This is just a chart briefly to show when EHP comes into it. Like I said, we're involved in all the various parts of the disaster life cycle, but for specifically when a major disaster is declared. So you first have the major disaster declaration, and that releases access to federal disaster funds. Normally public assistance funds, sometimes individual assistance funds and hazard mitigation assistance funds. All grants that are given as part of that funding must undergo EHP review. So we will review to some level at least all of those projects. Okay, so that was our first little overview of what EHP is and what the Stafford Act and the disaster cycle is. I will now be handing it over to Catherine for the next part of the training. Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to turn our attention to the primary historic preservation law that FEMA considers during EHP project review, and that is the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, or NHPA for short. So over the next few slides, we're going to introduce this important law, which serves as the primary framework for how FEMA and other federal agencies consider the potential effects of their activities on historic resources. Very quickly, just to give a brief historic context around the creation of this law, the NHPA was passed in reaction to the widespread demolition of historic properties during the urban renewal era of the 1950s and 1960s. It was during this time when huge areas of historic cities were being wiped off the face of the earth for the creation of new highways, new housing projects, and other redevelopment initiatives, many of which were being funded entirely or in part by the federal government. In particular, the demolition of the historic Penn Station in New York City is often pointed to as a major event which sparked the mainstream historic preservation movement in the United States as we know it today. It was considered by many to be a devastating loss, not only for New Yorkers, but for the soul of our nation. And it really became emblematic of the broader threat to historic properties in cities and towns nationwide. And the demolition of this really important building effectively ignited the flame under the need to enact legislation that would help protect our historic properties, or at least take a more thoughtful approach towards our actions that might affect historic resources. So the creation of the NHPA was really the culmination of a half a century of other cultural resource laws as well. Previously, there had been earlier measures to foster preservation in the country. These include things like the Antiquities Act of 1906 and the Historic Sites Act of 1935. But none of these previous laws were nearly as sweeping or as influential as the NHPA. And again, the NHPA really remains the primary historic preservation law, which gives us the framework for how we as federal agencies approach our undertakings with respect to historic preservation. The primary goal of the NHPA was and is to require federal agencies to at least consider whether what we're planning to do would affect historic resources, whether those might be significant historic buildings or structures, or even archaeological sites. And if there would be some effect to a historic property, the law then directs a process for considering the nature of those effects. Remember, Mary was talking about how many of our laws are process-based. NHPA is such a law. And when, on occasion, that we have an undertaking that will have an adverse effect on historic properties, the law provides direction to consider avoiding, minimizing, or mitigating those adverse effects. We're going to get into this in much more detail in the coming slides, but the important takeaway here is that by virtue of the fact that FEMA is funding the project or action, all FEMA undertakings require review for compliance under NHPA. The NHPA, why? Why do we have this law? I started to hint at it in the previous slide, but the main function of this law is to provide a historic preservation framework for federal agencies, one which defines historic preservation as the management of change, not a demand that all historic resources be perfectly preserved in amber for all time. This is particularly relevant when we consider FEMA's mission to help people before, during, and after disaster, and especially in areas of resilience and hazard mitigation, which recognizes that sometimes change is in fact essential for the protection of human life, health, and safety. But at the same time, NHPA requires us to recognize that significantly altering or destroying our physical history means that we can never truly get it back. This is especially true of archaeological sites, as well as archaeologically sensitive areas where there are baby sites that have yet to be discovered. We might be able to recreate or rebuild a building, I'll grant that, but the destruction of an archaeological site completely eliminates our ability to access that data forever. So the NHPA requires federal agencies to pause and reflect upon our actions that we propose to take ourselves or to fund, and proceed only once we have considered the potential impacts to historic properties. Probably the most relevant part of the NHPA to FEMA and our undertakings is Section 106. Specifically, Section 106 of the NHPA says that federal agencies must consider the effects their undertakings may have on historic properties. This is something I've already said quite a few times in the past 3 slides, but that's because this section of the law is what truly drives most of what we do as a federal agency to ensure historic preservation compliance. So you might hear also a FEMA historic preservation specialist use the terms NHPA and Section 106 interchangeably from time to time for that very reason. It really is the meat and potatoes of what we're driving at here. You'll see I've underlined those 3 important terms. We're going to tease each of those out and explain what exactly those mean on the next slide. So first up, consider the effects. This means that the federal agency must evaluate as objectively as possible what effects a project might give rise to, and that we must consider those effects during project implementation. Undertakings. This one's pretty straightforward, but for the benefit of mutual understanding throughout the presentation, a federal undertaking is defined as a project, activity, or program either funded, permitted, licensed, or approved by a federal agency. So if FEMA funding is involved, regardless of what kind of project or action is being taken, that means there exists a federal undertaking as defined by the NHPA. And finally, historic properties. What the heck does that mean? Does something need to be on a special list somewhere? Does a historic property need to be associated with a famous historic person? Does a building need to look exactly like it did when it was first built? Are we just going on vibes here? What does this even mean? Well, we're going to talk about how a property is determined to be historic or not a little later in this presentation. But for now, we're going to define historic property as a building, district, object, site, or structure which is listed on the National Register of Historic Places or has been determined eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. So let's continue to talk about Section 106 and how FEMA demonstrates our compliance with the law. First and foremost, as it's been said a few times, Section 106 is a process which does not demand a specific outcome. Remember, the goal of the National Historic Preservation Act is to require federal agencies to consider the effects that their undertakings may have on historic properties. Section 106 outlines the steps in a process that, when thoughtfully and meaningfully followed, fulfills that requirement. There are 4 major steps in the Section 106 process, as you can see on the screen. Each step contains multiple sub-steps and also possible ways to complete or exit the process along the way, at which point we would document compliance with the law. Very briefly, though, before we go into deeper detail, here are each of the steps. So in step 1, we initiate the process by establishing or defining the undertaking. Simply put, if it's an action or project being funded by FEMA, it's an undertaking. Pretty much simple as that. But beyond that, it's at this stage we ask, what are we planning to do? By which I mean, what is the scope of work for the undertaking? And who else might we want to talk to in order for FEMA to move through the remaining steps in the Section 106 process, again, in a thoughtful and meaningful way. More on that in a bit. In step 2, FEMA historic preservation specialists identify and evaluate whether there even are any historic properties at or near the project location that could be affected by the undertaking. In step 3, assuming that we have identified historic properties at or near the project location, a FEMA historic preservation specialist will address the potential for adverse effects to those historic properties. This is when we decide what type of effect the undertaking will have and if the project will negatively impact a historic property. Many times we're able to say with good confidence that an undertaking will have no foreseeable adverse effect on historic properties, and in this case that finding is documented and the Section 106 process typically ends there. But on occasion, some undertakings are found to have the potential for adverse effects. When these conditions exist, we go to the final steps of Section 106, this is where we're going to resolve adverse effects. So step 4 is resolve adverse effects, whether through avoidance, and maybe that's redesign to avoid doing or slightly change the part of the project that's causing the adverse effect, or abandonment of the project altogether, but for obvious reasons, that's not typically an option for us here at FEMA. Minimization is another possibility, which is, as it sounds, it's still going to be an adverse effect, but through redesign, we might be able to reduce the severity of that adverse effect. Or mitigation. When the adverse effect can't be avoided or minimized, we instead engage creative measures to offset that adverse effect. So now let's go through each of these steps in greater detail. Step one, again, so we initiate the process by determining we have an undertaking. FEMA funding, we have FEMA funding, therefore we have a federal undertaking as defined by the NHPA. So let's take our understanding of step one further by saying it's here where we establish whether the undertaking even has the potential to affect historic properties. Remember, every dollar spent by FEMA must comply with the NHPA, so some scopes of work we see truly have no potential to affect historic properties. For example, things like simply buying supplies or cutting paychecks, things of a truly administrative nature that have almost zero potential to affect historic properties. In these cases, we document that finding and Section 106 is complete. But for many other times, most other times, we may have projects that will have physical impacts in the world, which will require a harder look. So this is why it's so vitally important to provide a detailed and complete scope of work. How can we truly assess potential impacts when we don't know the full extent of what's being proposed? This is the step where we will often need to ask the applicant for more information through the RFI or request for information process. We need that information to determine the full scope of the project because it will direct how we complete the Section 106 process. In step one, we also identify potential consultation partners to help FEMA in this process and devise our plan to involve the public. Section 106 of the NHPA is very explicit about these requirements. We, as a federal agency, are not to make our historic preservation decisions in a vacuum by ourselves. So again, it is in step one when we think about what other parties we may need to talk to in order to move through the remaining steps, again, in a thoughtful and meaningful way. Among our usual consulting partners include the State Historic Preservation Officers, or SHPOs, and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, or TIPOs, as well as tribes more broadly, including state recognized tribes. Other potential stakeholders who may be able to help us gather information might be local historical societies or other groups or organizations. And of course the broader public whose input might factor into decision making in order to make really meaningful decisions through the Section 106 process. So FEMA's primary Section 106 consultation partner is the State Historic Preservation Officer, or SHPO. The role of the SHPO was actually created under Section 101 of the NHPA to delegate some federal authority to historic preservation for historic preservation at the state level. Their job is generally to administer state historic preservation programs, but also explicitly, as it says right in the law, to advise and assist as appropriate federal and state agencies and local governments in carrying out their historic preservation responsibilities. So we, federal agencies, consult with SHPOs to help identify historic properties during step two, as well as in step three when we're assessing effects to historic properties, and most certainly throughout step four, when, with their assistance, we have found an adverse effect and must now resolve those effects. There is some significant variation among what SHPOs call themselves from state to state, but they all serve fundamentally the same function. On the screen you'll see the logos for each of the 6 SHPOs in Region 1, and you'll see they all kind of refer themselves as something slightly different, but the basic function is the same. Another important frequent consulting party are the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, or TIPOs. Who, just like their SHPO counterparts, administer tribal historic preservation programs. The TIPO may assume all or any part of the functions of the SHPO to carry out the Section 106 process in partnership with the federal agency when an undertaking is on tribal lands. In other words, if a project is on tribal land, the SHPO might not even be involved at all due to tribal sovereignty. But even when a project is not specifically on tribal lands, TIPOs and tribes with interest in a project area frequently become consulting parties, especially whenever archaeology is involved or ground disturbing activities are involved. We all know that the lands we occupy today have been inhabited by the people indigenous to these lands since time immemorial, and that the belongings and influences and cultural observances of tribal people remain within the landscape. Thus, there is a potential to impact places of importance to tribes in many areas that may not be immediately apparent to non-Indigenous people. And it's vitally important to ensure that tribal input is carefully considered in this process. So the image on the screen is from a National Park Service features story on the archaeological study at the Stockbridge, Massachusetts 1736 Meeting House site, a site to which the Stockbridge-Muncie community has very strong ancestral ties to. The photo was provided by Bonnie Hartley, who is the Cultural Resources Director of the Stockbridge-Muncie community. Some other important established consulting partners we consult with include the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the ACHP, and the National Park Service. The ACHP is actually an independent federal agency created under the National Historic Preservation Act. They serve a bunch of important functions that we don't really have time to get into with this presentation today, but one function we'd like to highlight is that we always consult with the ACHP when projects are found to have adverse effects. We also call them in to serve as mediators when there are disputes with findings of effect. It doesn't happen too often, but that is in fact one of their important functions. And again, we consult with the National Park Service, typically when projects involve National Historic Landmarks. These are the special historic property designation given only to the properties of highest historic significance to the nation. The other function of the National Park Service that we may consult with them on are when there are disputes regarding a property's historic status. And I'm now going to turn it over to Kathleen.
Okay, now that we've completed step one of the process, we move on to step two, which is identifying historic properties. So how do we go about doing that? First, we determine the area of potential effects, or the APE, which encompasses both the direct impacts of a project and the indirect impacts. Indirect impacts could be visual impacts that a project might have on a surrounding area. So we don't just look at above ground resources, we also take into account all the areas of ground disturbing activities. This includes any temporary access roads, equipment staging areas, and the entire footprint of ground disturbance caused directly by the project. We do this to determine if there's any potential impacts to archaeological resources. Sometimes people forget that there are resources above ground and below ground. So when we're identifying historic properties within the area of potential effects, or the APE, we need to make reasonable and good faith efforts. We don't just look at some photographs and decide that nothing looks historic and move on. We really need to do our research and outreach by looking at databases and maps provided by the SHPO offices or the National Park Service. These resources help us see what things have already been listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or if any resources have been surveyed, inventoried, or listed in the State Register of Historic Places. We also do outreach to our tribal partners, typically the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, or the TIPOs that Catherine mentioned. And we did this in the case of the Sleeping Giant project. That's how we determined that the Sleeping Giant State Park is a traditional cultural property that's eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. If we hadn't done that outreach, if we hadn't talked to our tribal partners, we wouldn't fully understand the significance of this resource. In certain cases, additional research is required for properties to determine if they're eligible for listing on the National Register. So you might be asking yourself, what is this National Register of Historic Places, and what does it mean to be listed or eligible? So good question. So what are we looking at to decide if something's historic? We look at the age, we look at the significance, and we look at the integrity of the property. Just being old doesn't automatically make a property historic, but it's part of what we consider. We start really looking at properties once they're 45 years of age under the terms of our programmatic agreements that we use for our states. But younger properties are also possible to be historic. You might not look at buildings from the 60s and 70s and automatically think of them as historic, but they could be. So we still have to consider things and not just write them off based on their age. We'll discuss integrity in a moment, but first let's focus on what significance is. The National Register defines criteria for eligibility. The property has to have a significant association under the criteria to be eligible. And there are 4 criteria. You can see them up on the screen. Criterion A, events, activities, or development important to the past or the broad themes of history. So these are locations that are tied to important events. Say, for example, the Stonewall riots. Or broader patterns like the industrial development of an area, or say a port significant for its maritime trade. Where in New England we have a lot of these significant coastal areas. So the property has to be tied directly to the event or trend that it's assessed for its association with, meaning it has to be an important part of telling the story, not just one of dozens. And then we look at criterion B, a significant association with an important person or persons from the past. This one is where there can be a lot of confusion. It's not just enough to say that George Washington slept here. The property has to be associated with a significant event in a person's history. So that's kind of a joke we use in historic preservation. Did George Washington sleep here? But it has to be more than that. For example, the Customs House in Salem, Massachusetts, it's eligible under multiple criteria, including criterion B. And it gets its association for B by Nathaniel Hawthorne, an important historical figure. This is the site that inspired and where he wrote his famous novel, The Scarlet Letter. So you see it has to be a really significant association. Then we look at criterion C. Is the property an example of a significant work of architecture? Is it a historic landscape? Think like an intentionally designed landscape by Frederick Law Olmsted. Or is it a significant work of engineering, such as some really interesting bridges, for example? Again, the association has to be significant and a property a good example, not just every town or row house is eligible. We also use criterion C for works of a master. So seminal works of architecture or monuments associated with important architects or artists. We also use C for historic districts, where individually this group of properties might not be eligible, but when taken together, they are significant. You know, we're in New England. Think of mill villages. So you might have the factory buildings, the mill buildings, and then the associated housing that goes with it. So that is one other area where we use C. And then lastly, we have criterion D. Does something have the potential to yield, or has it yielded important information to history or prehistory? We most frequently use this one for archaeological information. That's what usually comes to mind first. But theoretically, it could be applied more broadly, where there's little information available about a construction technique or a particular style of building. Okay, so now that we've looked at what those 4 criteria are and determined if something is significant, the other important piece of the puzzle is determining if something has integrity. So there are 7 different aspects of integrity. You can see them all on the slide. And a resource does not have to possess all of them to be eligible for listing on the National Register. So let's just walk through these a little bit. For location, is the property in its original location? We like to see a resource in its original landscape or setting because it really adds to the character of a place. Then for design, has the form of the structure remained the same, or has it been significantly changed? For setting, has the location surrounding the property remained basically the same, or has it changed significantly by demolition or development? For materials, have the historic materials, think like the wood windows, the clapboard siding, the brick chimney, the stone foundation, have they stayed the same, or have they all been replaced? For workmanship, can you see the historic craftsmanship of a building? Feeling, this one's a little bit squishy, but basically we look to see if the property still gives you a sense of what it looked like historically. If you grab somebody from the past, would they still be able to recognize the building? So that's how we kind of judge that one. And finally, association. Is there still a link between the important historic event or person, or has the property changed so much that it no longer exists? Now that we've looked at the 4 criteria and assessed the integrity of the resource, we develop a historic context for the resource. Context asks us to answer the question, what set the stage for this resource? What trends or events in history led to the construction of this resource? And what has contributed to any changes in the property's function or appearance over time? So for example, we might be looking at an industrial mill complex. So the industrial development of the area is really important to understand. And say, as is the case in many industrial landscapes that we have in New England, the decline in manufacturing over the century and perhaps the mill's repurposing as housing or commercial uses would be important elements to consider when you're developing a historic context. Okay, so that wraps up step 2 of the Section 106 process, identifying historic resources. Now we're going to move on to step 3. So during step 3, we evaluate the potential effects of a project on any historic resources within the APE, which, as we know, is the area of potential effects. Don't want to use too many acronyms, but so it's always good to have some reminders of what they mean. So we do this by applying the criteria of adverse effect. You can see the formal definition on the screen, but basically we're looking to see if the characteristics of a property that make it eligible for the National Register will be altered. So any of those 7 aspects of integrity that we went over, will they be significantly diminished by the proposed project so that the resource would no longer be eligible for listing on the National Register? That's what we consider in this step. And there are 3 potential outcomes when we're evaluating the effects of a project. We call these finding of effects in Section 106 lingo. So you can have no historic properties affected if no historic properties were identified in the APE as you underwent that process. There can also be no adverse effect on historic properties if a project scope will impact the historic property that's in the APE, but not enough to diminish its integrity. And lastly, we can have an adverse effect if a project scope of work does diminish the property's integrity, which in the case of the Sleeping Giant project, that was the case. It was a finding of adverse effect, and that's why we've developed this training. Okay, so we've gone through the first 3 steps. Now let's move on to the final step, step 4 of the Section 106 process. This is where we resolve adverse effects. So we have a historic resource. The project will significantly diminish its integrity. Now we need to either avoid, minimize, or mitigate the adverse effect. If the project can be redesigned to avoid or minimize impacts, we can probably get to a finding of no adverse effect, which is great. But that's not always possible. So if impacts cannot be avoided or minimized, we look to mitigate those adverse effects. We have ways to go through this process. Our programmatic agreements, which we'll talk about a little more later on, they allow for what's called the abbreviated consultation process. This is used when stakeholders agree that a formal document, like a memorandum of agreement, isn't necessary to resolve the adverse effect. And we work together on a treatment measure package that will satisfy all stakeholders, all parties. This can be a photo documentation package of a resource, development of educational training or an interpretive panel, or other potential creative solutions that all the stakeholders work together to decide. If a memorandum of agreement is necessary, as it was with the Sleeping Giant project, the document language is developed by all stakeholders, and then a legally binding agreement is signed. So the Memorandum of Agreement, or the MOA, it outlines treatment measures to resolve the adverse effect. And as I mentioned with the abbreviated consultation process, similar treatment measures can be used for the MOA. These can be maybe an archaeological survey or an avoidance plan, photographic documentation, an architectural survey, an interpretive panel, or educational training. So for Sleeping Giant, we worked together with the stakeholders, and an interpretive panel was developed, and also this educational training. So once step 4 is complete, we have completed the Section 106 process. I will now turn it back to Mary, who will discuss more about Section 106.
All right, so now that we've been through the Section 106 process in a little bit more detail and explained what is involved at each step, now we talk about how that applies to FEMA undertakings. So FEMA is a federal emergency management agency. Are we required to review every project under Section 106? Well, not every project has the same potential for impacts under Section 106, but all projects are all federally funded undertakings, as Catherine defined, do have to be reviewed for potential impacts to historic properties. So yes, all projects have to go through the process, but not all projects have to go to the same level or the same extent of a review under Section 106. Some undertakings have great potential to impact resources. Some resources are particularly sensitive, like Sleeping Giant was, which is a tribal area of religious sensitivity, or a National Historic Landmark. But other projects go through much more quickly because they just don't have the same potential to impact the resources. Before we get more into the process, I want to talk about some exemptions that do exist to the National Historic Preservation Act process and how FEMA manages those exemptions. So one of the primary ones that we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides is exemptions for emergency actions that are undertaken to do immediate rescue and salvage. Obviously, firefighters are not going to stop and do a Section 106 consultation if they need to get into a building to save a life. Right? So that is an activity that is exempt. FEMA does have those activities. We are an emergency management agency, and so we have set up a process for how we handle those and how we document it that we'll be covering on the next few slides. Section 106 does provide for an exemption for emergency situations. Like I said, those are the immediate rescue and salvage operations that are conducted to preserve life or property. They are not every emergency action. We have Cat B. It's not every Cat B project, not every emergency preparedness activity qualifies for an exemption from Section 106, but some of them do. An emergency exemption for FEMA typically can be used to cover a project when it is implemented within the first 30 days after a disaster and when it is directly tied to life-saving activities. Sometimes projects are exempt if we have to put in a temporary culvert where there is the only access to a neighborhood and we need emergency access for ambulances or fire trucks. That can be an exempt activity under certain instances. It wouldn't be for the ultimate repair, the permanent repair of that culvert, but the temporary repair might qualify. So there are things to do. Section 106 defines and lays out the requirements for that as part of its implementing regulations. I don't think we've talked about the 36 CFR 800 yet, but 36 CFR Part 800 lays out in distinctly bureaucratic language the process by which federal agencies need to go through in order to document their compliance with Section 106. So the part that covers the emergency provisions is in 800.12D specifically. And like I said, it only applies really to those immediate life, health, and human safety situations, the ones where we cannot stop and take a step back and we just need to get the mission done and make sure that we are taking care of our communities. Just to go into a little bit more detail on that, particularly for agencies like FEMA, where we have a lot of life, health, and human safety activities under our rubric, the 36 CFR lays out a specific process to set up more standard procedures for how to address those emergencies. That's under 800.12A. Basically, it says that federal agencies can take a variety of steps to develop specific procedures. We can and have developed emergency procedures. We did that during COVID. We developed a specific agreement with the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, federally recognized tribes and SHPOs throughout the country that developed streamlining activities because the urgency of the need to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic was so great that our normal emergency provisions were not sufficiently addressing the need, so we developed a new agreement. We can also develop programmatic agreements. FEMA has a prototype programmatic agreement that basically lays out a framework for how we do Section 106 response. We have them in the vast bulk of our states these days, and definitely in our 6 New England states. I'm going to talk more about those on the coming slides. Okay, so in Section 106 programmatic agreements. What is a programmatic agreement? A programmatic agreement, frequently we do love acronyms, as I think Kathleen mentioned, so we call them our PAs. A PA is a document that spells out the terms of a formally legally binding agreement between a state or federal agency and or other state, local, tribal partners to address how we're going to be reviewing something. It doesn't just apply to Section 106, though it is our most frequent law under which we use programmatic agreements. We can also develop these to address a variety of environmental and historic preservation review considerations, including ESA, wild and scenic rivers, our concerns for critical fish species and the like. We have a couple of different programmatic documents that we use. But here for Section 106, specifically, as I mentioned, we had developed a national prototype that lays out the kind of basic framework under which FEMA will review projects. It provides, as we'll discuss on the next few slides, some streamlining activities and ways to simplify the review both for FEMA and for our applicants to just make sure the process is more transparent and more easily predictable. And then we basically use that prototype by consulting on a local basis with each of our SHPOs and tribes to decide if we need to make any tweaks to that broader prototype or if we need to make any special requirements for how we review or how we get access to information associated with historic preservation. Information, like I said, we work with the SHPOs and the tribes to identify where there are known historic resources or there may be areas of particular sensitivity for archaeological resources. So part of the agreement is how we share and get access to that information. We have 6 of them, each for one of our 6 states. And they are really, really critical tools for us in managing our Section 106 and our National Historic Preservation Act responsibilities more broadly. What does the programmatic agreement do? Like I said, it provides streamlining and reviews and sometimes can minimize or eliminate requirements to consult in some undertakings, particularly those who have little to no potential to affect historic properties. Catherine, I think, mentioned some of these. These are things like purely administrative actions, doing desktop surveys or reviews that don't involve any ground disturbance, drafting up hazard mitigation plans. We also use them sometimes under IA for community counseling initiatives that we do in areas, or providing funding for existing services within a community, like helping to cover the costs of childcare or providing food to communities. Those are all things that would not require or would not have the ability to impact historic resources, and therefore we have a process by which to kind of exempt them. All of these streamlining initiatives do help us prioritize those projects which really do have the potential to affect resources and focus our energy and the energy of our state, local, and tribal partners on the ones where we really do need to have more in-depth discussions and work through the process a little bit more in depth. It also streamlines our consultations. As we know, as I mentioned, the bulk of our work does happen in the recovery space. We need to get our communities back working to the best of our ability as quickly as we can. So part of our PA shortens the time frame by which we need to that it takes to complete Section 106 reviews. Basically, under normal regulations, states and tribes have 30 days to review any consultation we send them and provide comment and feedback back to us. For those public assistance projects, for those really emergency projects, that timeline is shortened down to 15 days. And then we have other streamlining tools like programmatic allowances, which in some cases, when the needs and requirements of that allowance are met, remove the need to consult with the SHPO's office. The benefits of these really, like I said, is to allow us to focus on the projects that have the greater ability to impact things, and also just to reduce costs for everyone on what consultations involve and how many reviews we need to be sending to our state and tribal partners. So what is in these programmatic agreements? They are long. They are very lingo heavy, so they're not necessarily something you want to take to the beach with you to read unless you wish to fall asleep. But they are still very critical documents. Hey, there may be some people who really do like reading those. There are those people out there. I am not one, but they are still really critical documents. So basically the framework of a document is this. It starts out with the whereases. This section of the document basically lays out, who is involved in this, what is the purpose of this document, who did we talk to in developing this document. It basically lays the foundation and gives everybody the background so they understand what the document is and where it's coming from and why it's there. And then we step into the stipulations. I won't go through all of them, but basically the stipulations lay out people's roles and responsibility, lays out specific actions and timelines that people are required to follow to complete these activities. And it basically just sets up the process review process. Basically, it lays out the steps that we take in order to review a project and how we share that information and documentation of those steps with our state, local, and tribal partners. Like I mentioned, it talks about, and we'll do a little bit more later, it talks about our use of programmatic allowances. Programmatic allowances are projects that we have, or types of projects that we have worked with our SHPOs and tribes to determine, hey, we've reviewed these projects a lot. We've sent you several consultation letters for projects like these, and we have determined that they really don't have the likelihood of causing adverse effects to resources. They very frequently result in no historic properties affected determinations and no adverse effect determinations. And so we've basically come to the agreement with our partners that, hey, when we have these projects and when we meet these certain conditions, we won't be sending in a formal consultation. We will document that it meets an allowance, and we will provide a report at the end of the year outlining which projects we have used these allowances on, and just kind of give you some oversight on it, but it does reduce the individual project review responsibilities for those. We talked about emergency consultations before. There's also a section explicitly outlining them. That section also grants FEMA the ability to extend emergency consultations beyond the initial 30 days. When we have really a community that's been really seriously impacted, we have the ability to say, hey, it's going to take us more than 30 days to get through some of these really critical actions. So we can extend them out as long as we receive concurrence from the SHPO and on our tribal partners when they are signatories to the document. It outlines our standard consultations, what we do for the vast majority of them. In most cases, that pretty closely mirrors the standard process under Section 106, but there are some little time-saving measures that are in there. It also outlines our adverse effect consultations. Kathleen, I think, mentioned this a little bit when she was talking about the different ways that we resolve adverse effects. Our programmatic agreements outline standard mitigation packages that can be applied. It's kind of like a menu of options. Those are for projects where we really understand the impacts and they're either relatively minor or relatively straightforward, and we think we can address them very easily by using this abbreviated consultation process. It's a major time saver for us and really does help get our communities to recovery faster, though we can use them not just in the recovery phase, but in mitigation and preparedness as well, and frequently do. And then we have our after-the-fact consultation reviews. This is actually something that's very unique to FEMA. Because we're an emergency response organization, we know that sometimes things move faster than our documentation process can cover, right? So in instances where maybe a disaster hasn't been declared for several months and the community is already moving forward to doing its recovery and is rebuilding, just because they have already started the rebuilding process before disaster is declared, that doesn't necessarily mean that work can't go through the EHP review process. It just means that we have to do it in an after-the-fact way. After-the-fact reviews are not guaranteed. But we do try in most instances to see if we can do an after-the-fact review. In order to do an after-the-fact review, we do have to consult with the SHPO and the tribes and see if they believe it is feasible for us to do so. There are some cases where we cannot put that cat back or the genie back in the bottle. I'll use that analogy instead. And we just can't, we cannot recover from something that's happened. That happens a lot. Particularly in areas of religious or cultural importance or areas where there's a very sensitive archaeological feature. But we do try to at least see if there's a way forward for many of these projects. But it's a case-by-case basis. So ideally, the best thing is always to wait until FEMA is there and FEMA can help you, but we know there's those instances where we just cannot wait and repairs do need to move forward. Lastly, it's our unanticipated discoveries clauses. Sometimes we do our best to identify resources. We do our best to determine whether there are archaeological sites in the area, but we do get surprised. Sometimes there are discoveries that are made. We think an area has been significantly previously disturbed, but it is not. And projects I've worked with in other parts of the country, we've had areas where we had a 6-story building on a property, and when we tear it down and look under the foundations, it turns out that the entire patio from the house that used to be there before that tower was built is still there. Or we've got the cellars or other features of the property that really can tell us a lot about its history are still there and recorded in the ground. So when we encounter those, we've got to stop and assess how it's going to, what we're going to do to address that resource and how we're going to go forward. So that's a more benign one. The other unanticipated discovery I have happily never personally had to deal with, but does happen, are unknown burials. If human remains are discovered, that's a major stop. And we've got to stop. We've got to talk to both the local and state authorities to determine whether or not this is a historic burial or a prehistoric burial, or whether this is a much more recent burial, in which case we will hand it over to the authorities and we will back off. If it is of an older vintage, then we do consult very much with our tribes if it is a pre-contact period burial, or with our SHPO in the case of more historic burials. But hopefully, knock on whatever wood is immediately available to me, we will not have one of those pop up here in Region 1. And then lastly, we have the appendices. These are just, the appendices include things like our programmatic allowances, like our menu of treatment measures. There's also an appendix that outlines all of FEMA's various grant programs. It is 4 pages long. We have a lot of grants. We don't always use all of them, but they do exist and they are good resources for our communities. And then at the end, there's also some things like how we specifically document certain things or special streamlining initiatives for particular states that are a particular focus for them. Okay. So Catherine already talked about these, so we'll just go through them real quick. Basically, actions that have no potential to affect historic properties. Like I said, not a comprehensive list, and Catherine already talked through a lot of them, but administrative actions, personnel actions, travel supplies, anything where we are just spending money to purchase things that have already been produced, are moving them about monitoring, data gathering, and reporting, as long as there's no ground disturbance associated with it. So these are Lot 4 hazard mitigation plans or our engineering drawings that are just being developed as part of phased projects. As long as there are no borings going in, we can only cover those under one of these stipulations. If there are borings or other kind of soil analyses, then it would not apply for that. We'd have to address it another way. Training, management, and administration. Most of these apply, but occasionally we get a special one. Sometimes we have chainsaw safety training, so they're actually going to cut down trees. That might apply for NHPA, but it might not. There are resources that can be significant in terms of our natural resources. And of course, we'd have to review it under other environmental laws. And then there's other times, we had one where they wanted to dig trenches as part of the trainings and do a trench exercise. Obviously, that's ground disturbance, and so it did not qualify under this stipulation. Labor, equipment, materials, if you're just buying trucks or paying for overtime, that's not something we would do. I mentioned crisis counseling earlier and assistance to individuals and households. That's food, that's childcare expenses. Those kind of things do not have the potential to impact historic resources, so they do not require the same level of review. And then finally, I kind of already went through these, but I'll do it real quick one more time. We have the appendices in the document. This is just the outline of the appendices that are in the Connecticut statewide programmatic agreement. Like I said, there's an appendix listing all of the FEMA programs which trigger Section 106 review with a summary of each. So if you're looking for what grants FEMA has, this is a good place to look those up. Appendix B is our programmatic allowances. That's the list of activities that are exempt from consultation, but still have the potential to impact resources. There are conditions for the application of each one of those allowances, one of which is the type of staff that have to review that. It has to be, a project has to be reviewed by staff that meet the appropriate qualification standards and have been determined to meet those standards by FEMA as an agency. And they have a list of, okay, it'll apply in this case, but not this case. So like we can do culvert replacements, but not if they're stone. We can do, we can demolish buildings if they're less than 45 years of age and aren't historic, those kind of situations. But there's a whole list of them, and we have them for all types of resources that are out there. Appendix C is the treatment measure discussion. That's that menu of potential treatment measures that we can do. Kathleen mentioned a few of these. It includes photo documentation, historic register nomination forms, or just what is a common one that we like to do is public interpretation. That's a way of sharing information with the public despite the impact to the resource, and it is frequently a good way of creating a silver lining out of a potential issue with a project. So we like to do that. And then Appendix D in this case is just for the types of maps and other information that the SHPO needs from us in order to help review their projects. Okay, so that is it from me for a little bit. I will pass it back over to Kathleen.
Okay, so now let's move on to a discussion of how we utilize National Historic Preservation Act best practices throughout the disaster cycle. If you take one thing away from this presentation, we hope it's that we, meaning FEMA, and you, our state, tribal, and local partners, have the potential to be our best allies so that we have the most successful historic preservation outcomes. Following best practices helps everyone and allows the FEMA funds to get where they need to go most in the most efficient time frame. You know, we want to make sure that the communities that need to rebuild get the funds as soon as they can. So what does this mean? What are some of the best practices that we hope to see under the National Historic Preservation Act? We can't stress this enough, that the more information and the more details that FEMA receives about a project up front, the faster our environmental and historic preservation reviews can be complete, and we can move the project on to the next step of the FEMA process. Provide as much photo documentation as you can. This helps us better understand the project, since we oftentimes are not able to see the project area in person. If you have before and after photos showing the area and the damage, those are incredibly helpful for our review. Also, up-close photos showing any details of the damages, or if repairs are already completed, show us what those repairs look like. Those are very helpful. Please provide the most accurate street addresses or GPS coordinates that you can get, so we're not looking at the incorrect areas. I actually had a project, there was one number off on the Latin Long for the project area, and instead of being in Massachusetts, I ended up in the Middle East on Google Earth. So after a lot of confusion, I was provided the correct coordinates. And as the slide says, this is one of those times where too much information is never too much. It's always better. Provide us whatever you can provide. We do understand that if life and property hang in the balance, you might not be able to run and take a photograph, and that's okay. As Mary said, there's certain times it's just an emergency. We understand that. We also know that some work has to be done immediately before we can engage in the Section 106 process. Mary also mentioned, we can do after the fact consultations. They're not always ideal and they're not guaranteed, but we can work with the SHPOs and the TIPOs and see if it's possible. But really remember, whenever possible, hold off on permanent work if you can, so we can complete our EHP review first. And just in general, ground disturbing activities, if you are doing bridge work, roadway reconstruction, tree removal, these can have big impacts on archaeological resources. And these impacts can't be undone. If an archaeological site is damaged, we can't fix that. So if possible, avoid significant ground disturbing activities before FEMA reviews the projects. And just a reminder, FEMA EHP, that's us, all these people who are happy to work with you. We can be available as technical assistance resources when your town or your state office is going through the initial process of the disaster cycle. We're involved in the early preliminary damage assessments, the exploratory calls, the resource scoping meetings. So if you have questions that you think EHP staff can help you with, please do not be too shy to ask. We are definitely here to help. So now we're going to go on to the phases of the disaster cycle. And Mary had shown us the wheel in the beginning, and we'll get more into the nitty-gritty of this. So we have the response phase. In the response phase, things are happening quickly. If there is damage to a property that's known or suspected to be historic, please contact the State Historic Preservation Office and let them know. There's a provision in our programmatic agreements that says immediate rescue and salvage operations to preserve life and property are exempt from Section 106, and urgent actions not exempt from Section 106 can be handled after the fact if necessary, with the caveats that we explained. But just remember to document as much as possible. Document the damage, document the work. That way we can know what's actually going on. At the response phase, the most common NHPA pitfalls usually center around debris management, like when tree damage occurs and root balls are removed and not documented, or debris from damaged buildings is removed, and this, we just have to make sure that this is documented in this response phase. If this is all ground disturbing activity. Some people don't think of debris necessarily as ground disturbing activity, but it is. So try your best to document what you can. And we're going to discuss more of this. So debris removal, it's not just a historic preservation concern. It's also an environmental concern. So the best practices of debris management are to take photos and record the location of the debris before its removal and provide the location of its final disposal. We like to say FEMA EHP needs to know the whole life of the debris from cradle to grave. So we need to know where it came from, what you did with it, where it ended up. Some things to remember with downed trees, the best way to handle them is by flush cutting and pushing the debris to the roadway edge. Avoid removing root balls whenever you can, because that causes extra ground disturbance. And lastly, use debris staging areas that have already been established and approved. Avoid creating new ones if possible, and utilize existing hardened surfaces like existing paved parking lots or the town's transfer center. We don't want to be creating new debris staging areas that can have a whole number of impacts on either historic resources or environmental resources. So what happens when a structure or a building is damaged, and what's the best practice for this type of debris? So if a building is damaged or destroyed, it might need to be demolished out of public safety concerns. This does happen. We've seen it happen. Again, we suggest that you document, and call the State Historic Preservation Office, that SHPO office that we talked about, that we partner with. As soon as possible, call them, let them know the building might need to be demolished, even if you're not sure if it's a historic resource. Because at this point, you're probably not, you wouldn't be in contact with FEMA EHP, so go to your state resource. And remember that we're not only concerned about the structure itself. If it's a historic resource, of course, we're concerned about that, but demolition activities cause ground disturbance, which can also impact archaeological resources. And as we say on the slide, contact the SHPO as soon as possible. if you are in these instances. Okay, so for the response phase, what are the key takeaways? So always do, of course, what you must do to protect life, health, and safety. That's most important. But when possible, wait to complete work until FEMA EHP is able to complete our reviews. As we mentioned, after the fact reviews are possible under the National Historic Preservation Act, but they're not always ideal, and they can cause delays, they can cause additional costs, or possible denial of projects from FEMA public assistance. So we also encourage potential FEMA applicants to reach out to the SHPO for guidance, and do not knowingly try to avoid the requirements of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, because this could lead to a project not being compliant, which we're going to discuss more in just a little bit. There is Section 110K of the National Historic Preservation Act. I'm just going to go into this a bit. What you need to know is it prohibits a federal agency from granting assistance to an applicant who knowingly tries to avoid the requirements of Section 106 and adversely affects a historic property. So don't try to avoid Section 106. We have to do it, and trying to avoid it will not be a good outcome. So we want to work together and get these projects funded. So that wraps up my section for now. I'm going to pass it over to Catherine, who's going to discuss best practices in the recovery phase next.
All right, so next we're going to move out of the immediate response and look at best practices and potential pitfalls as we transition into longer-term recovery. You'll see once again this repetitive refrain of document, document, document. During the initial response, when things are moving fast, it can be really tough or impossible to take a bunch of pictures or record GPS locations where debris has ended up or damage has occurred. But as things slow down and enter the recovery phase, this is often the best opportunity to begin really assessing the situation and documenting the damage. And remember, the more information you can provide to FEMA, the more frequently we can avoid requests for information, and the faster we can complete our review and get your project funded. FEMA is usually present during the recovery phase, and so EHP will be available to help answer any early questions you might have and provide some technical assistance. We'll also be present on preliminary damage assessments to help identify potential EHP challenges, including early detection of potential NHPA concerns. I'll talk more about PDAs on the next slide and how emergency managers can help us by using best practices during these efforts. But in general, the most common pitfalls we have observed during the recovery phase have to do with post-response debris management, ground disturbing activities of all sorts, but especially equipment access routes and staging areas, and repairs and replacements of damaged infrastructures and other facilities which might have historic importance. We'll talk about each of these things in greater detail in the coming slides. So before a disaster is declared, and usually during the earlier side of recovery, FEMA will be present during those joint preliminary damage assessments, or PDAs. Whenever possible, FEMA will send at least one EHP staff member to be on each PDA team going out to look at the damage. And we're there to begin doing some of our own documentation in case a disaster is declared. We're also there to help flag some of those really apparent issues early on. And while PDA teams might not be visiting every last damage location, usually they're focused on the bigger dollar damages to make it to the threshold for requesting declaration. But state emergency management and the communities they serve can really be of tremendous help if they take the PDA teams to damage locations that might have a higher potential for EHP concerns. As we've said, some of the major triggers are locations that involve or will involve a lot of ground disturbance or damaged facilities over 45 years of age. Having us look at those locations early on in the process will really give us a real leg up in the event that a disaster is declared. When we're in the field with you, we can provide early technical assistance that can help avoid, potential surprises for everyone later on as the process moves along. Once the disaster is declared, we'll start getting a little further into the recovery phase. FEMA will set up exploratory calls, or ECs, and recovery scoping meetings, RSMs. So many acronyms, right? Just as with the PDAs, we try to have at least one EHP staff member present for all ECs and RSMs. It's not always possible, but we do try, again, just to have early eyes on each potential project. And if it's appropriate at the time, sometimes we can provide some technical assistance. Applicants can help support best practices during ECs and RSMs by, just coming prepared to these meetings with supporting documentation, such as photos, descriptions, ages of damaged facilities if known. The location info is really important. All of these things can get us off the block running, especially if we see anything that catches our attention for potential concern. The EHP green sheet is usually a one-page document with the Cliff's Notes on EHP compliance, including a condensed write-up on NHPA. It will also include contact information for questions. This is usually distributed at applicant briefings, but we'll also offer it again during ECs and RSMs. But like I said, the green sheet has EHP contact information on it, and we really do welcome your questions, and please use us as a resource. So let's start talking about some of those pitfalls and how they can be avoided. So beginning with the continuation of debris management, as Kathleen started to describe. As we mentioned under the response slide on debris, EHP needs to account for debris from cradle to grave, from collection to ultimate disposal. And so documentation of debris at each step along the process will be very helpful in our review. And from an NHPA perspective, the documentation we like to see include photos and GPS coordinates. Additionally, if debris needs to be collected and staged before final disposal, continue to engage those best practices for collection and staging by limiting it to previously hardened surfaces such as parking lots or at designated areas like transfer stations in order to avoid inadvertent ground disturbance. There are two specific areas of debris management that bear a little additional discussion, and these are the management of or removal of root balls and the management of debris in and other types of work in cemeteries. So let's begin with root balls. First off, just to provide some clarification, what I mean by root ball is the mass of roots at the base of a tree. So we've seen several high wind events here in New England the past few years. We've seen more upended trees with exposed root balls. And we've really had to consider our approach to reviewing projects dealing with root balls to ensure we're considering these projects' potential to affect historic properties, because oftentimes the measures taken to deal with upended trees and root ball removal are what we would consider ground disturbing activity. Any type of ground disturbance has the potential to affect historic resources. We've developed some NHPA off-ramps for some of these projects. We have some allowances in our programmatic agreements for some of these, but they do need to meet very specific conditions in order to avoid the full consultation process we described earlier. But depending on the location of the root ball and the methods used, sometimes this work will still require EHP to complete consultation with the SHPO and tribes. Let's look at some best practices when dealing with root balls. The preferred treatment for upended trees with exposed root balls is to cut the tree at the base of the trunk and tip the root ball back into place. This method presents the least potential for NHPA concerns and will yield the fastest review. When a root ball is just tipped back into the ground, it's very rare that EHP would have to undertake any special consultation with SHPO or tribes. But we do understand that the cut and tip method isn't always preferred or even possible in some cases, and instead the entire root ball needs to be removed. As I mentioned, some root ball removals are exempt from full review by SHPO and tribes. However, there are very specific parameters involved, and in order to help us determine whether those requirements are met, we need, wait for it, good documentation prior to removal. At minimum, we will need the tree location. Usually an accurate GPS location is the best way to document that. And we also need to know the diameter at breast height, sometimes abbreviated as DBH. If all possible, wait before taking action to remove the root ball and seek guidance from EHP, but we understand that waiting is not always possible. So that brings us to the next slide. There are going to be times when it's not possible to wait, such as in instances where root balls may represent risks to life, health, and safety and just need to be removed ASAP. This is when it's especially important to fully document the damaged area by recording the tree's GPS locations. Additionally, take clear digital photographs of the trees from all angles prior to removing the root balls. Remember, again, there's no such thing as too much information when it comes to documenting this information. Too many pictures is always going to be better than too few. This info will really help us determine if it meets that NHPA exemption or provide us with the info we will need in order to complete a consultation. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kathleen to talk about best practices for work in cemeteries.
Okay, so cemeteries are sensitive areas in many ways. So what should we do when we're working in them? Avoid removing root balls, as burials may be included in the root balls, and we do not want to further disturb them. And we have seen general debris removal in cemeteries, sometimes causing more damage to gravestones, stone walls, gates, or buildings in the cemetery than the original disaster caused. Sometimes that process can be messy. So what should we do to make sure that we're not causing more damage and that we're documenting things properly? Use all the considerations that we previously discussed when working in cemeteries, but also remember to document all root balls or damage to the cemetery before taking any action. And as Catherine said, tip the root balls back into place instead of removing them. Okay, so what else should we remember about cemeteries? Avoid using heavy machinery within the boundaries of the cemetery if at all possible. If that's not possible, try to keep equipment on paved surfaces since heavy equipment can damage gravestones, cause further ground disturbance, and whenever possible, try to use hand tools to cut and remove debris. Also avoid staging debris on unpaved surfaces within the cemetery because this could cause further ground disturbance or damage to the cemetery itself. So what are some of the big takeaways to remember during the recovery phase when it comes to cemeteries? Damage can occur in many aspects of the cemetery, whether it's the gravestones themselves, any walls, gates, or buildings that might be in them. And in New England, there's a high potential that the cemeteries are over 45 years of age. So let's make sure we document all the damage with photos and GPS coordinates. Do any temporary stabilization of damages if necessary for safety concerns, but otherwise try to avoid taking action until FEMA EHP has been able to review the project. We also understand that in many cases you need to do work to allow facilities to function. So this is where temporary work can be done to stabilize resources. Or if repair or replacement work must be completed, in-kind repairs are always preferable. And I'll get into what we mean by in-kind in just a moment. This type of work can typically be cleared by FEMA EHP under the programmatic allowances that are included in our programmatic agreements. But if you need to make permanent repairs that are not in kind and change the pre-disaster condition of the property, try to wait until we have been able to review the work. So what do we mean by in-kind repairs? We have a really strict interpretation under the National Historic Preservation Act of what in-kind repair means. We truly mean in-kind, so the same or similar material that looks the same. It's very important that repairs are done correctly by qualified staff, or they could cause more damage to a facility if done incorrectly. For example, using inappropriate materials to repair gravestones could cause further damage to the stones themselves. There are qualified professionals out there who know what materials are best to use on different types of stones. And you can also reach out to FEMA EHP or the SHPO's office for technical assistance. The SHPO's office also has a list of qualified professionals who can do certain types of work. So that's always a helpful resource to utilize. Now I'll pass it back to Mary, who's going to discuss some examples of work completed before FEMA EHP review.
All right. So as we are talking about the recovery phase, we want to give a couple of examples of when projects did go forward in some of these more sensitive areas, or areas where we have greater potential to affect historic resources, and where we did have to do some after-the-fact consultations or ways to try to find a path forward, despite the fact that historic properties were ultimately impacted by our projects. The example that's currently on the slide now is a project that was directly focused on repairing a railway culvert. The initial project had come in and had stated that they intended to replace the railway culvert from the rail line itself. So they didn't think there was going to be any ground disturbing activities or no new ground disturbance associated with repairing the culvert. But unfortunately, when they went out to actually make the repair, the contractor said that shutting down the railway for the length of time that it would be necessary to make the repair was just too long and would have significant economic impacts on the entire state. As a matter of fact, this is one of the main rail lines there. Unfortunately, rather than coming back to FEMA at that point in time, they moved forward with continuing repairs. To do so, they had to cut an access route to access the culvert from the right-of-way of the railroad. In this particular case, it went over private property that they had leased in order to construct the access road. And because it didn't go through the full EHP review, it ultimately impacted and damaged 3 known archaeological sites that were within the path of the access road. FEMA worked very closely with the SHPO and the tribe that had an area of interest that overlapped this area, as well as with the project proponent, and we were able to come up with a path forward. But it has taken and continues to take actually many years. This process started back in 2018. We are still working on it here today in the year 2023. And so these projects, particularly things like access roads, particularly things that cause new ground disturbance in an area where there has not been previous disturbance, are very significant EHP concerns, not just under the National Historic Preservation Act, but there are also potential issues with the Endangered Species Act. Also, in some instances, with the National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA, our umbrella law that oversees all our projects, and essential fish and other resources that we can't always recover from. In this potential instance, the main concern was the National Historic Preservation Act and the damage to those archaeological resources, but we have had other instances where more laws were triggered as well. Okay, so that's access roads, which are again a major trigger point for us. If you need to construct an access road for your project, you should absolutely be consulting with FEMA as early in the process as possible, or reaching out to your state historic preservation officer, as well as the other environmental regulatory agencies in your state, to work with them on doing those reviews and ensuring we head off some of the more complex outcomes and reviews that might happen if you move forward without them. Like we mentioned before, there's always the potential that we won't be able to recover, we won't be able to do an after-the-fact consultation. So of course, to avoid that ultimate issue of non-compliance and denial of federal funding. So just to give you one other example, this is actually the project that triggered the need for this training. This is the Sleeping Giant State Park entrance. The photo on the left is the photo before the microburst that occurred in 2018. The photo on the right is the aftermath after they had removed all the debris and staging, all the debris that had come down during the storm. Basically, the microburst caused trees to snap halfway up their trunks, and in some cases to knock down trees entirely. In order to reopen the park and make it safe to visitors, they had to remove about 12 acres worth of trees, and also to cut a wider access road to the top of the slope. You can't see that visible on here, but that's another aspect that they did. And in order to cut the access road, they actually had to remove stone from the sides of the mountain in order to widen the trail. Both of these things involved ground disturbing activities and direct impacts to resources of religious and cultural significance to the tribes in the area, both the federally recognized tribes and state recognized tribes that have ancestral lands in this area. And it was very concerning. Whenever we have impacts to those kinds of resources, it's a very significant concern for us. We try to do our best to minimize impacts to those types of resources whenever we can. In this case, all of this work did happen within the months following the storm, kind of before FEMA was on the ground and before FEMA was working with them. So we were able to work with the tribes and the SHPO to develop a mitigation package. As we've discussed, it included both an interpretive panel, this presentation, and an acknowledgement ceremony for the tribes, where we talked about their history and the importance of these lands to them. So again, we've talked about debris management, we talked about access roads. They really do have the potential to impact these resources, and to the greatest extent possible, it is best to either coordinate with your state and local resource agencies and the SHPO's office, or to wait for FEMA to arrive and assist you with that review process. Okay, so key takeaways for the recovery phase. Work to stabilize and restore basic function as quickly as possible. We understand there's work that needs to be done in order to provide safe access and help your community return to its normal daily lives. But to the greatest extent possible, we ask you to hold off, particularly when dealing with things that may impact sensitive resources, whether it's constructing access roads, doing major ground disturbing activities, doing repairs to historic buildings that could result in key changes to the building. All of those things that are really things we'd like to be able to work through with you rather than coming in after they've been done. But we understand sometimes it just does move forward, but whenever possible, we do ask that. Be very careful with ground disturbing actions of all kinds. If you can avoid ground disturbance, if you can find another way to do a repair or do something, then it does help greatly both streamline the timetable and the costs associated with projects. If we need to come in and do archaeological surveys or anything else, there are timeline considerations and costs associated with those, particularly here in New England, where we have such a long winter and sometimes the ground is frozen and we just have to wait till the spring. So that does greatly delay things in some instances. In-kind repair and replacement is always best when we're talking about historic properties. We know that doesn't necessarily apply to a culvert that needs upsizing, but when you're dealing with the repair of a building, as Kathleen mentioned, it is really critical to make sure that those repairs are in kind. It is very easy to cause inadvertent damage to your structure if you're not doing in-kind repairs. I don't think we mentioned this one, but one of the key considerations is to match mortar types when you're dealing with masonry buildings. If you have the wrong type of mortar on certain historic buildings with certain types of brick, you can actually cause substantial structural damage to your building. If the water cannot escape through the mortar, it will escape through the brick, and you will soon have a very crumbly wall, which no one wants. So that is really critical. If you're dealing with a historic building, you definitely want to be making sure you're taking those into consideration and how you do it. Explore measures to avoid or reduce potential harm to historic properties. That means if you know you're going to have to make a substantial repair, you may want to do some stabilization activities before FEMA gets there, so that you can at least support the roof if it's going support the roof if it may be structurally compromised, or support the porch, or do any of those kind of activities to kind of give us the time that is needed to review that more thoroughly. And as always, please feel free to contact, or we encourage you to contact the SHPO or reach out to FEMA EHP for some technical assistance during this process, so that we can try to help you problem solve and find the best solution to whatever situation you're dealing with. And And then just to go back to, we talked about the 4-step process earlier in this presentation. This is another look at another map of the 4-step process. The recovery phase is where the vast majority of FEMA Section 106 consultations and reviews take place. We review hundreds of them every year. And as we've discussed, sometimes there are off-ramps early in the process. There are those activities we discussed that might be exempt from Section 106 review, emergency undertakings with no potential to affect resources. And then as you move into step 2, the situations where we have identified resources but determined our projects will not be impacting them, or if we need to move all the way through the 4 steps. But again, this is where the vast majority of our projects are seen. So this is another thing we really just want to highlight, particularly in the response and recovery phases. We frequently have situations where, like I discussed with the railroad culvert project, where we initially submit a project, we submit a scope of work, it is fully reviewed and documented, and we have met all of our requirements. However, then you get out into the field, the reality is a little bit different. You can't repair that facility in the way you thought you could. You can't get access to it, or time has passed and additional damage has occurred. So you have to reassess how you're going to address the issue. So you have to change your scope of work, or change the methods of which by which you're going to undertake your recovery. Those need to come back to EHP and back to FEMA. One, because there can be cost implications for you on the grant side that program needs to review, but also because there may be additional EHP review requirements that need to be done to make sure we're addressing things, like the construction of that new access road, like changes to suddenly you thought you would be able to stay in the dry, but you end up having to do work in water. That might bring up additional permitting requirements or considerations that we need to take a look on. So do just know that if you are doing these, it does trigger additional reviews, and you do need to come back and just go through the process to make sure that you remain compliant with all the laws. The goal of EHP here really is not only to get you the money, but to let you keep it, right? We don't want anything that may bring the project into non-compliance down the line. We want to make sure that everything stays successful and moving forward. So please do make sure that if you're encountering one of these situations, that you do reach out and do talk to us. It may not require that much of a review. We may be able to look at it and say very quickly that no, this isn't a concern. But if there is a concern, so much better to know about it beforehand than after. Because again, sometimes we just cannot recover from situations where they have become non-compliant and we just can't make the repairs, and then we do have to consider whether or not there will be consequences to the funding. This is the next thing I just want to briefly address is the post-recovery phase. After the repairs have been made, we do a final review at closeout for many projects, particularly those who have had real potential to impact resources or may have had an adverse effect. And as we do that, we do want to document that any condition that we apply to the project, any requirement to install an interpretive panel, or to do some outreach has been complied with. We'll need documentation of that. We need photos frequently of the completed work so that we can ensure that, say, you said you were going to be working in this area, that's where we did the work. We didn't have to go outside that or do any additional ground disturbance. So after the award and construction is completed, we do this final kind of checkout of the project just to make sure that everything went according to plan. It's rare, but occasionally if there was a scope of work change that didn't make it back through the process, or there was something that was changed on the fly, we may need to do a final consultation under Section 106. But just if we do identify any inconsistency in the original scope of work in the final one, but hey, ideally you've sent that scope of work change back to us and we have been able to review it initially, and so we can just do a real quick cleanup check on the project at the end and get it closed out and get you any final funds that may be available under that grant. All right, and now I will be passing it to Catherine to talk about the mitigation phase.
Okay, moving on now to mitigation. As we mentioned near the top of the presentation, the mitigation phase is where we're looking to reduce long-term risks to life and property from future hazards. As I'm sure you're mostly aware, a disaster declaration also makes a certain amount of funds available statewide for hazard mitigation projects through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And these funds can be used for a wide variety of actions that don't necessarily have to address damage from the disaster itself. Everything from developing community hazard mitigation plans to drainage improvement projects to structural retrofitting, slope stabilization, water crossing upgrades, and so forth. FEMA also has other hazard mitigation assistance programs which are not tied directly to a disaster declaration. These are programs like the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, the Building Resistant Infrastructure and Communities Program, or BRIC, among others. I'm not really going to get into the details of these programs here, but we're going to look at some of the ways historic preservation can and should factor into mitigation activities. Both those physical actions that are taken to mitigate risk, as well as development and refining of hazard mitigation planning. Due to the nature of mitigation and its goal to plan for the next event and build better to reduce future risk, many of the physical mitigation projects we see often involve making proactive changes aimed at reducing risks, whether that means changes on the landscape or changes to buildings, or changes to infrastructure like dams or bridges or levees. So just saying that word change over and over again, that should start sending up some flags for you based on what we've already covered. Thinking back to our definition of preservation as the management of change, these are projects that will often require some higher level consideration for historic preservation, simply due to the fact that they very often, not always, but often mean making some kind of physical change. They're frequently going to require Section 106 consultation for one reason or another. So just as we discussed before under the heading of recovery, EHP will always need to have a really full, robust understanding of the scope of work and a total accounting for all ground disturbing activities, including those access routes and staging areas we keep harping on about. Sometimes the details of those construction means and methods can be overlooked when developing a project or writing up a narrative scope of work, but we cannot account for the full potential of a project to affect resources without that comprehensive scope of work. It's also really important to keep FEMA apprised of any scope of work changes throughout the process, just as Mary was describing. This includes any changes that become necessary during construction. We've had some experiences in the past, like Mary said, when a project has come in for closeout, and only then do we discover that some major departure from the scope of work as originally proposed has caused some major NHPA headaches. We've had a project where changes in the field without adequate notification to EHP led to that, there was that access road being run across those known archaeological sites. And many years later, we are still in the process of resolving those adverse effects. When in reality, notifying us of that proposed change before taking the action really could have helped everyone avoid that problem altogether. So help us help you avoid these kinds of needless complications by just letting us know before proceeding with any scope of work changes. In addition to actions taken to physically mitigate risk on the ground, I also mentioned hazard mitigation planning. We don't have really time to get into the ins and outs of hazard mitigation planning today, but in a nutshell, it's best described as the process during which communities identify and assess risks that might result from natural and man-made hazards and get a good understanding for the potential impacts to important community assets, and then plan for possible ways to avoid or minimize those undesired effects. Of course, heavy emphasis naturally should be on reducing risks to things like emergency services and other critical actions or infrastructure. But there are a good number of reasons why integrating historic preservation considerations into hazard mitigation planning is also a good and potentially important practice. For one thing, we've said it a few times already, but things like historic buildings and structures, important monuments, even historic documents, all of these things which help form a place's unique historic identity, they're all truly irreplaceable and could be lost forever in a disaster if not considered in the mitigation planning process. Another great reason, especially here in New England, so many of our communities are desirable places to live and visit because of their historic character. When disaster strikes a community's historic downtown, for example, the identity and economic vitality of the community can be wiped out. And building onto that, some of our local economies thrive on tourism driven by historic nature of these places or by important historic landmarks in our communities. And then that tourism, of course, feeds money into other businesses and services that communities depend on for jobs and tax revenue, etc. So failure to plan for the protection of historic resources could have lasting economic effects. And finally, we have to consider that these resources in many ways embody the soul of a place. And the loss of these resources is all the more painful and ironic considering how often residents rely on their presence after a disaster. The way places help reinforce connections with neighbors in the larger community and seek comfort in the aftermath of disaster. Following disaster, it's comforting to look around and still see some semblance of what makes a place home. On the left, you'll see the cover of a publication FEMA developed quite a number of years ago now, but the essence of its message remains the same. It's a really excellent resource to help integrate historic preservation into state and local mitigation planning. And as with other FEMA publications, it's available as a PDF on our website, but it's also really easy to find just by Googling FEMA publication 386-6. And finally, we've come to the preparedness phase. And it's very appropriate that we're nearing the conclusion of FEMA's presentation. As Mary mentioned at the beginning, this phase is when we want to start taking actions to be more ready for the next time disaster strikes through additional planning, training, and generally making preparations. So right now, taking the time to sit in on this presentation, taking the time to learn more about how historic preservation should factor into the actions we take throughout the disaster cycle. This serves the goal of preparedness because you will all be better prepared with this information before the next disaster strikes. Other preparedness actions we can take include the continued identification of historic resources in our communities in order to take better informed response and recovery actions in the future. This is also when we can take proactive steps to document older structures, such as bridges or culverts, which can be really helpful during the recovery when we reference those photos to help guide a faithful in-kind repair, for example. It's not unusual for EHP staff to request pre-disaster photos of a damaged facility, only to receive the response that no such photos exist, and that sometimes makes it a little more challenging for us to complete our review. So any action you can take now is to be better prepared for the next disaster will ultimately pay off in the long run. And always, we stand ready as a resource. We want to help support your preparedness, and we are just an email or phone call away. And so we've reached the end of our presentation today. And just to wrap up with some conclusions, I hope the main driving thing that we've gotten after here is that your actions throughout the disaster cycle really have the power to drive an efficient and successful NHPA outcome. The efficiency of our review and the success of our review really relies on partnership with our consultation partners and open, free-flowing communication. And of course, that goes back to including you. As much information as you can get to us, the faster we can get our project review completed and make sure that your project is funded and compliant. Again, document, document, document. There's no such thing as providing too much information. We rely on receiving those great photos, the GPS coordinates, and any information that you can provide with us up front to really smooth this process. We want to get your project across the finish line. EHP is not here to say no. We are really motivated to make sure that we get this done as quickly as possible while meeting our compliance requirements. And we're going to do everything we can to help. And again, we stand here alongside you to assist throughout the process at any point. The FEMA Region 1 EHP professionals would love to hear from you. If you have any questions about the process, or if you want to touch base before taking some action, we're here. We want to be used as a resource, so please do not hesitate to get in touch. And thank you. That concludes today's presentation. Again, send your questions, comments, or concerns to us. We'd love to hear you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. I want to thank everybody for hanging in there. We're almost at the end. And I want to thank FEMA for providing such a comprehensive presentation about Section 106. So for those of you who don't know me, but I think I know most of you who are on participating today, my name is Catherine Lamadia. I am the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer and the Staff Archaeologist at the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office. And I am joined by my colleague, Marina Wisniewski, who I will let introduce herself in a few minutes. I'm just going to briefly go over the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act, because if a state agency is undertaking a project, Section 106 may not always apply, but it will likely fall within the regulatory provisions of the Policy Act. And when I'm finished doing that, Marina is going to close out today's presentation by explaining how to initiate consultation with our office pursuant to questions. So also feel free to use the chat or start thinking about any questions you might have. So when we wrap this up, we're ready to go. If you could go to the next slide, please. While Section 106 is only a consideration of historic properties, the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act, or SEPA, considers a wider variety of resources. It is the state agency version of the federal National Environmental Policy Act, and both laws put cultural and environmental resources within public trust. As has been stated earlier by the prior presenters, cultural resources like natural resources such as threatened and endangered species or clean water are given this regulatory consideration because once they are lost forever. And I think, like many of you, our office is passionate about preserving these resources, and so we work really hard at trying to find the right balance. Next slide, please. SHPO's role within this process, and I recognize that today's presentation is probably well beyond what most of you needed or wanted to know about cultural resources, but what I want you to walk away with today is that basic understanding of regulation, and that the decisions we're making regarding cultural resources are neither arbitrary nor capricious, that we work within a very well-defined framework that has very well-defined language. I know a lot of the terms that were used today might be foreign to everybody else on the phone, but this is how, you know, us in the historic preservation world, how we talk to each other. And these phrases are well-defined and have a lot of meaning. And every state that you go to has a SHPO office, and we all use this same framework that's defined by Section 106. So our office looks at approximately 3,000 projects a year. Some of them may be only federal through the National Environmental Policy Act or through Section 106. Some are only pursuant to the Policy Act. But there is a great amount of overlap between the two. And sometimes a project may start off as only a review within our office under SEPA and end up federal in the end. And for that reason, our office chooses to use that federal framework of Section 106 to do all of its reviews. This way, a project can be carried through any process at a local, state, and federal level. And that language is well defined, it has meaning, and it doesn't require you to keep coming back to our office again and again if you find out that there are multiple triggers associated with the project, which is often the case. So I hope you're all paying close attention, because the procedural steps and the language defined is what you will expect whenever you engage with SHPO in the regulatory process. Next slide, please. When in doubt, you can always look for information on the Office of Policy and Management. They have great, and it is updated information available to agencies about the projects that may be subject to review, how to go about this review process. If you or your agency reviews the guidance manual or uses the environmental classification document, you will see that all references to SHPO also do include the references back to the federal language that we've talked about today. And while I didn't list it, here as when in doubt, our office, like FEMA stated, is always available for technical guidance and advice. We are a sister state agency. Our website lists all of our contact information. We're happy to provide any guidance to get you through the regulatory process, or even to give advice on non-regulatory projects. So even if you have a historic resource that you're a steward of and you need some advice regarding how to maintain it, or any other questions about what is an appropriate treatment, we are here to answer those questions. I will say that our office has been working on a multi-year process of digitizing all of our inventories of cultural resources and putting them into a GIS system. So we are hoping early next year to kick that off with the Office of Policy and Management. And this way, it's a little bit of a self-service for agencies who fall under these regulatory purviews. You will be able to go to this GIS system and look up known cultural resources that could potentially be impacted by the project. So it might be something that can assist you with that project planning early without having to contact our office. However, I'm going to still strongly encourage you to reach out to our office. And the reason is because I hope one of the things that will also become clear today is that while we have a good handle on knowing what we already know, there is a lot out there that we don't know. So a lot of, we can make predictions and estimations of where we expect historic resources to be, but sometimes we don't always know that until we actually conduct a survey. And so, that's why that portion of the presentation today about, how it is we find out what we know is really important. And again, we're happy to provide you with that technical guidance and advice when you need it. So that brings us to the next step. When you are ready to talk to SHPO, I am going to turn this over to Marina now, and she can walk you through that process. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Good. Still morning, everyone. I'm Marina Wisniewski. I'm a historic preservationist at the State Historic Preservation Office. So I primarily deal with above ground resources when we're talking about environmental review and compliance. So Kathy gave a very good overview of the theory and method of how we review these projects. So I am now going to do a practical walkthrough of the manner of which we go about it. So as a quick sidebar, I find that including silly pictures or memes in my presentations helps people remember the concept that I'm trying to get across. So just prepare yourselves. Because so many of our projects include both state and federal funds, our office has streamlined the process to use a single form, and that takes into account the different types of funding. It lists each different type of funding or permits a project may be utilizing. And because our state laws are similar to our federal laws and they dovetail with one another, we've adopted the same type of process and language to complete the review. So our correspondents will use the language you saw today when completing consultation in accordance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So our process for consultation begins by using this form, the project notification form. It's used for all projects, federal, state, to help project proponents meet their compliance requirements. It is available on our website at ct.gov/historic preservation. I'm actually going to put that in the chat because this is the only place to get the most current form other than requesting it directly from staff. We often get forms that are very out of date, and it doesn't include the most updated information, and it may be a little bit more complicated. Right now, we are accepting digital copies alongside hard copies. As Kathy mentioned, we are hoping to work to a digital submittal system where we won't have to have paper copies. But right now, we do need a hard copy that needs to be submitted for records retention. The address is at the bottom of the form on the second page, and it's also on our website. Or if you have any issues, you can reach out, and it's in our email signatures. We designed the form to be fairly straightforward, and it requests information such as location of the project, who is proposing the project proponent, the scope of the project, and what state or federal agencies are involved. Next slide. So it's very important that you complete the form as thoroughly as possible. Incomplete forms delay the process because we have to try to figure out exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. I want to pause for a second to highlight this orange box that is outlining a section on the first page of the form called the project description. Next slide. That space is for a quick summary of the project. You will probably not be able to describe the entire project within that box, and that's completely okay. That's not what it's for. It's not a complete project narrative. It's not a complete set of construction plans. It's for us to get a general idea. Excuse me, that is my schnauzer. It's to get a general idea of what you're doing. I guess I'm not that entertaining. For instance, is it a new construction of a 4-story building? Are you doing rehabilitation of an existing building? Are you doing ground disturbance? This is the whole reason that we created the form is to get that information up front. We will review all the supplemental information that is attached. That's why we ask for it. But when we first receive the submittal, we need to know that information up front. Another great example, and that Mary and crew brought up, if involves ground disturbance, including staging areas or things that you might not think in your head, are large ground disturbance, please also include that, because I'm an above ground person, but that type of project would have to go to our archaeologist for additional review. Next slide. So the attachments should be anything that you have that will help us understand the project. If you have drawings of the renovation work, please include that. If you are building new on an open parcel, include a soil map so we know if there is a potential to contain archaeological deposits. The more you can share with us, the more likely it is we won't have to ask for more information. So we didn't include sections just to be confusing or just to make it look like you're not submitting enough. They really are meant to make the review as efficient as it can be. But that being said, we are always looking for ways to improve this form. We usually meet and talk about it, probably once a year. If you have any suggestions, feel free to send us an email. Some people have submitted suggestions that actually, as Kathy mentioned, we have this language that we talk to each other, but that language may not always translate to the public. So if you have a suggestion, please feel free to submit it. It's important when you are planning this to plan ahead and allow for enough time for this project to be reviewed. Typical initial response is 30 days. That is that federal timeline that we borrow, and that's the timeline that we use for state projects as well. So next slide, please. However, if you did not include all of the information, we're going to have to reach back out to you because, as Kathy mentioned, while we know a lot and we know more every day, and we have these great data systems that help you identify it, we don't know everything, and new things are coming up, and we won't really know until we go out there and have a survey. So we want as much information as we can to really make that first sort of determination in our process. So if we don't have all the information that you have, we'll probably have to reach back out to you, and that will probably take more time. So as a rule of thumb, the more complete an application is, the less time it takes to review. I want to feel like Joseph DeCreux when I get your submittal, not Robert Downey Jr. And the easiest way to do that is to complete the form, send in any documents that are relevant to the project, and if you are just utterly flummoxed by the form or what to include, we are here for you. Reach out to us early. This is our chosen profession. We love talking about historic resources, and we love sharing that passion with everybody else. So if you have a question, just reach out, and that's going to be the end of my quick presentation, and we are here to answer any questions you have. Thanks, guys.